Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.25, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at the chorus effect. So that's a fairly common effect, and before we actually look at the chorus specifically, let's just read what our good friend Wikipedia has to say about it. So Wikipedia states, in music, a chorus effect, sometimes referred to as chorusing or chorused, occurs when individual sounds with roughly the same timbre and nearly, but never exactly, the same pitch converge and are perceived as one. While similar sounds coming from multiple sources can occur naturally, like you'd hear with either a string orchestra or a choir, it can also be simulated using an electronic effects unit or signal processing device, and that's exactly what we are going to take a look at here inside of Bitwig Studio. So one thing you might have noticed before, I never went back into our studio input-output panel and changed this off of mono. So that's why when I was going through and clicking on those presets, you didn't hear too much of a difference. The amazing thing is that we didn't get that huge phase cancellation, which typically would have been a dead giveaway that I was in mono. Again, one of the reasons why the blur is a very cool effect and one that you actually really need to go in and experiment with, because as you could tell, I was so stupid, I didn't even turn off the mono when I was flipping through those presets. But let's turn our attention to the chorus. And the chorus, much like the blur and much like our delay, is relying to a certain degree on the precedence effect. So if you look at time here, we can go all the way down to 3 milliseconds, which typically isn't in the chorus range. A lot of times people will say the chorus range is like 15 to 30 milliseconds, and it goes all the way up to 40 milliseconds here. So we can kind of choose a time anywhere between that, and we're going to get one of those smearing or chorusing type effects. We also have an LFO, which I'll talk about in just a minute. We have a high cut filter here if we want to try to take out some of those highs. We also have a width control, okay? So we can really try to push the chorus effect out wider, or we can bring it in and keep it somewhat mono, which isn't going to have that big of an effect then on the actual signal and how it sounds. So first things first, let's take a listen to this and pull back so that we can start out with something very initialized. I think the sine tone might be a good one for this. Let's take a look at it here. Okay, so we can definitely see some movement happening. That's probably thanks to our LFO. So let's turn that off. Let's pull our width back. Some phasings happening there, you can see. And that's pretty good for a default. Let's take a listen to it with the chord. Okay, cool. So I'm happy with that as my initialized. I'm just going to go in here and save it as chorus, Brian, init. Perfect. I'm happy with that. And now let's start messing around and seeing what we can come up with. First things first, let's talk about what this LFO is going to do. So LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and I'm not actually going to explain exactly what that means. All I want you to think about with the LFO is cyclical modulation. Okay, so modulation that's occurring to some parameter, and when we say modulation, we're referring to change. Some kind of change that happens in a cycle repetitively and never stops, okay? So it's forever unless you tell it to stop. So if I was controlling, let's say, the time as an LFO, if I was perfect at this, I would be able to turn it up and down like this indefinitely. But that's going to be very difficult for me to do, and I'd like to have free hands to do other things. So an LFO is going to allow me to set that up so that I actually don't have to do that myself. And inside of Bitwig, they actually have what are referred to as modulators. And there's an LFO modulator, and I'm just going to pull that up for now. We're going to talk about this a lot more as we progress in this course, but for now, let's take a look at this, and we're actually going to see what it's doing. So in the case of this LFO, it's a sine wave. Okay, so it looks like this, like we've talked about with the sine wave, and it's going to change any of these parameters indefinitely at the speed we set here. We could also actually sync it to our time, and then all we have to do is map it. So let's pull up a chorus effect here, and let's just set it to the mix so we can see what it looks like. So I'm going to choose this option at the top to map it. Now I'm just going to pull up, and we can already see that LFO working. It's maybe a little bit too much. Let's set it right there. Click it again. Turn this parameter up so that's going at that stage. We can adjust the depth so it doesn't go as high or as low. If we want to bring it back, just very subtle, pop it way up. We can also adjust the phase, so where it's actually starting on that sine wave. So if we want to start like at the very peak, we could pull this up to like, I don't know, 25%, I think would be correct. Not all that important. And then of course we can change the speed here. So the point where it's almost imperceptible to wicked fast. Okay, and once you start getting above 20 hertz, typically it's audible. So we'll talk all about that later. But for now, just think about the LFO. That's what it's doing. So when this LFO is actually changing some of these chorus parameters here, that is what it's doing. You just can't actually see it. So let's get rid of that LFO for now, turn our chorus on here, and start messing around a little bit. The first parameter we're going to mess with is time, because time is what's really why this is a delay effect. And as we change this, we're going to get different timbres to come out. See if we can find something nice. I like it in there. If we want, we can cut out some of the frequencies on the chorus. Maybe dull it up just a little bit. I'm going to keep the mix below 50% for right now. And now we can start to mess with its width parameter. And we can add extra wideness by clicking the wide button. You can really hear how much of an effect that's had. So now let's actually try switching this into mono and see what happens. Okay. And last but not least, let's start adjusting this LFO. And this is where you're really going to start to hear that chorusing effect that you're so familiar with. You can tell this is really fast at 20. Pull it back down to something reasonable. If we want, we can again change the phase on that sine wave. By default, it was at 25%, so it's starting right at the top. Or a triangle if we want. And now we can listen to this chorus effect on some of our other sounds in here. Not as big of a difference. There we go. You're going to need to dial in different settings for all of these sounds if you want to get something that you really like. How about the drum loop? Add some width and punch to it, actually. Actually sounds pretty cool. And then our sine waves, of course. Right, that's super cool. Could speed that up. All right, I'm having just way too much fun messing with the chorus on sine waves. And one of the best things to do is to just mess around with all of these effects on the sine waves to see what happens. So we can see here what's happening. Boring and very interesting. Switch this into mono. Yeah, so that one's having a little bit more of an impact when we actually turn it into mono. So always be wary of that if you need a mix that has to translate onto a mono system. So that's really the chorus in a nutshell, a very easy effect, but something that's been used for a number of years and can really enhance some of your simple sounds. And what makes sound really interesting is what I like to call repetition and modulation. So for example, if I'm telling somebody a story, people are going to be interested in that story, hopefully the whole way through, because I have the ability to change my voice, right? To add inflection, to really get excited at certain parts, or maybe to pull back at other times, change my pitch, change my speed, change my amplitude, all of the things we've talked about with sound. But at the same time, there's that familiarity of my voice, which is going to keep people interested as opposed to switching every minute or something and someone new comes in to tell the story. That's the analogy I like to use with music and with sound a lot, because we do like repetition to some degree. So like we would like to keep hearing that sine wave throughout, but we're going to like it having some modulation, some change, whether subtle or extreme. And that's what really makes sound and music so interesting to us. I'll leave it at that for now. I hope you guys found this to be quite useful. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at the chorus's friend, which is the flanger. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching.